Pilla talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. And he wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. If you do have a current tax problem, call the office or visit TaxHelpOnline.com. If you don't have a current tax problem, then your current tax problem is taxes. So let's get into the policy issues of today. We got a couple issues to talk about today. First of all, I saw a couple of memes, which is, of course, how we get our news today, is memes, about Buddy Carter and his income tax repeal bill that is supposedly hitting the floor of one of the Congresses, be it the Senate or the House. I'm not entirely sure of. But is this new news or is this old news? What's the deal with this?
It's only new in the sense that they're going back for another bite of the apple. What Carter has introduced is the fair tax. Now, the fair tax has been introduced a number of times in Congress. And just for the benefit of the listeners, you said, Josh, that you weren't sure if it was introduced in the House or the Senate. The Constitution requires that bills with respect to revenue always have to originate in the House of Representatives. So every initial tax bill always started in the House of Representatives. And it's because it's the people's house, all right?
No taxation without representation. I like the little pun they're trying to make.
Yeah, and the only thing worse than taxation without representation is taxation with incompetent representation. So that makes it even worse. Fair tax is a bill to fundamentally eliminate the Internal Revenue Code and the income tax as we know it and replace it with a broad-based consumption tax, a broad-based retail sales tax. So that's what the fair tax is all about. That's the essence of the legislation.
You're saying they were coming back for another bite of the apple. Are we at the core yet? How many bites have they taken? How many times have they tried to do this?
Well, we aren't at the core yet, but we're getting close. I haven't counted them up, Josh, so I can't tell you an exact number, but it's been at least a half a dozen times. The fair tax has been introduced in Congress over the last 15 years or so. I think it started in about 2000 or 2001. I will tell you this, the foundation of the fair tax is the model of the national retail sales tax that I built in the early 1990s, right? So my book, How to Fire the IRS, was released in probably 92 or 93, right in there somewhere. And I had a legislative model that I created that was published in that book. And that's where the fair tax came from.
Is it directly pulled from you, or did a bunch of other people get inspired by you? How did that come about?
Well, yeah, mostly it was inspiration. The legislation they're calling the fair tax is not exactly precise what I proposed in my book, but it's very, very close.
What about this external revenue service? I had to laugh at the concept, but I would much rather have an agency that is trying to chase down other countries for tariff money than going after citizens.
You know, here's the thing. We got to put this in perspective. President Trump has proposed to create an external revenue service to collect excise taxes from foreign countries, basically import duty. Those duties are now collected by a different department of government. They're not collected by the Treasury. So what Trump will do is create a separate division of the Treasury Department, much like the Internal Revenue Service, that he would call the External Revenue Service. And he would cause all external taxes, import duties, and excise taxes to be collected by that function of government. Okay, fine. We're collecting excise taxes right now, right? So the idea of collecting excise taxes is not new. Obviously, the Trump proposal has been to increase excise taxes considerably, and they're talking about replacing internal taxes like personal income taxes, Social Security taxes, corporate income taxes, these types of things. They're talking about replacing those with revenue collected externally, revenue collected from foreign governments through excise taxes and import duties and so on. You and I have talked about this in the past. I do not think that is a sound idea. First of all, the idea itself is not insane. Obviously, we would rather our tax burden be carried by external sources than internal sources. I believe that is sound thinking.
On that same note, I was just wondering, maybe would that work well in tandem with a retail sales tax, in that retail sales tax might inherently push people to go and purchase their goods and services from a foreign country that doesn't necessarily have as high a sales tax in order to try to avoid a tax burden, which is what people do.
Yeah, the nature of man is to run from taxes. You're exactly right. You know, what you tax, you get less of. And so if you've got a retail sales tax on product A and not a tax on product B, people are going to gravitate to product B. There's no question about it. That's why the tax has to be broad-based on all consumption goods and services. And the fact of the matter is, it wouldn't make any difference where the product originates from in terms of its production. The tax is imposed at the final point of purchase at the retail level. So if you've got product A that's manufactured in, Tennessee, or product B that's manufactured in Taiwan,
Sure.
It wouldn't make any difference. When the product is sold at the point of purchase, the retail consumption tax is paid at that point.
Let me pause you there, because it doesn't drill into the minutia of the point, which is there are going to be the people who can afford to go out of the country and to bring things comes in. For example, go and buy a boat outside the country and then use it inside the country. There's got to be some method for them to not avoid essentially the tax of buying American, more or less.
You're exactly right. And that's what we call a use tax. So sales and use taxes are piggybacked with one another, just like estate and gift taxes are. All right. So the Congress imposes an estate tax. You say, okay, I'll just avoid the estate tax by giving away all my stuff before I die. Well, that's where the gift tax kicks in. So estate and gift taxes operate in tandem. Sales and use taxes operate in tandem. And we see this in states across the country. Minnesota, for example, has an 8% sales tax, 8.5% or 8.25%, whatever it is. And you say, well, I'll just buy my goods in Wisconsin where they got a 5% sales tax. Well, the use tax requires you, when you bring something in like an automobile, a boat, any of these types of things, you buy it out of state, you bring it into the state. Well, guess what? You got to pay the use tax to the state of Minnesota, which is basically figured at the difference between the tax you paid in state A and the tax you would have paid in state B. When we're talking about import duties, we don't really have that problem because the taxes are assessed at the point of purchase when they're brought into the United States. Now, I suppose in the example that you just gave of, you buy a boat in the Bahamas and you bring it into Miami, well, at that point it becomes registered in Miami. That's where a use tax would kick in at that point in time. The problem that we're talking about is the practicality of raising $6.5 trillion, which was the federal budget last year, in external taxes. It's not practical. And every time we hear somebody talking about the idea that the federal government operated for over 140 years, certainly all through the 19th century, on excise taxes and import duties, that's a true statement. It did. But the budget of the United States government was tiny by comparison, and it was able to be funded through those minor sources of revenue. Right now, there's about 6 major taxes that exist at the federal level: the personal and corporate income tax, the estate and gift tax, the Social Security tax, the unemployment tax, and then these import duties and manufacturers' excise taxes. All right. Those are the 6 taxes. 5 of those 6 taxes raise 98.5, about 99% of all federal revenue. Manufacturers' excise taxes and import duties raise about 1%.
Until we completely slash the government spending, it's just not a realistic.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, already we're dealing with a deficit between what's spent and what's collected, right? The amount collected is roughly $5.5 trillion, call it 5.7. The amount spent is another $1 trillion north of that, right? So they're collecting, just call it $5.7 trillion right now. Almost half of that money comes from the personal income tax. And we're talking about $300 billion that's coming from the manufacturers' excise taxes and the import duties. It's about 0.5%, call it 1% of revenue. It's just insignificant. And so until federal spending is slashed, and I mean slashed, there's no chance of replacing the personal and corporate income tax entirely with just that revenue. It's just not realistic.
On the topic of slashing, do we have any hope of this next administration coming in and being slash friendly?
Well, here's the problem. They're talking about slashing the administrative elements of federal government, which is fine. I'm all in favor of cuts. I don't care where they come from, right? But the fact of the matter is about 60 or 70%, maybe even more than that. I'm going to have to take a more careful look at this, but just talking in round numbers, roughly 65 to 70% of all federal spending is transfer payments, Josh. All right, taking money from person A who earned it and giving it to person B or corporation B that didn't earn it. Form of federal subsidies, grants, these loans, student loans are gigantic, of course. We're talking about all of the funding that goes on with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. All of that funding is transfer payments. That's where the spending is coming from. And there's no question that the military spending is high, but that is a category of spending that's authorized by the United States Constitution. Obviously, right now, the interest on the national debt is becoming a huge problem as interest rates have gone up here in the last couple of years. No question about that. As the national debt has exploded to 33 or 34 trillion dollars, it's a huge problem. No doubt about that. But if you get rid of those two things, which you can't do, by the way, can't get rid of military spending, and you can't just eliminate the interest on the national debt. That's impossible. Now we got to focus on transfer payments, because if you don't, there's no other place to cut.
That begs the question, though. It's all transfer payments, meaning we're taking money from one place and putting it somewhere else. Most of the money is that, and we cut that out. What does that look like for the economy, and what does that look like for the national debt? Because, I mean, we're still spending all the money on defense, but then we're just not taking the money from somewhere. And when they take the money from somewhere, not every one of those pennies from that dollar is going to that next person. They're doing something with some of it.
Of course not, because it's all being laundered through the federal bureaucratic apparatus. There's no doubt about that. Of course, works if you stop the transfer payment, taking money from person A, giving it to person B. If you stop that, you stop the money laundering process that goes on at the federal level. That's true. So you got 3 million bureaucrats that have to go out into the marketplace and get an honest job. And that's fine. I got no problem with that.
So what you're saying is not only will the slashes cause 3 million people to lose their job, but it'll also have the results of kicking grandma out of her nursing home? I don't know if people will go for
It
this.
was nonsense because these social safety net functions have always been the responsibility of state and local government. And they need to again become the responsibility of state and local governments. And I would break it down even farther than that. And I would say local governments and charitable organizations, not even state governments, local governments and charitable organizations. First 150 years of this country, there were charitable organizations throughout America that provided these social safety net programs, operated through churches and through synagogues and through other charitable organizations. And Catholic Charities come to mind. And there's all kinds of them, right? They're everywhere. And they operated at a very high level during the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And it was only in the early part of the 20th century, the 1930s and moving forward, when governments encroached on those social safety net functions and essentially drove charitable organizations out of the social marketplace, because people would say, well, if government is providing all these services, why do I have to donate to charities to allow them to provide these services? And so that was the friction. The governments came in and supplanted those services. And that's what we have to resort to, is local governments and charitable organizations providing the social safety net service. That's the model that works.
Right. And at the risk of getting off topic here, it makes me wonder, how much was it the government that came in first and tried to supplant the charitable organizations, or was it people losing faith in the churches and the charitable organizations that caused the government to get their foot in that door?
That's a good question. A chicken and egg argument. And the answer is, it was the government encroachment that did it. There's no question about it. Taxes were going up to provide these programs. People had less money to give to charity. And so that's what distorted the market. Remember Jefferson's quote about government encroachment. The natural order is for government to encroach and private interest to recede. That's the natural order, right? And so it always is a function of government to encroach in these areas and for private sector elements to get pushed back.
You have another link here about the IRS's new commissioner that is coming in with Trump's administration. What do you have to tell us about that?
The Trump nominee for IRS commissioner is a guy named Billy Long.
Billy Long.
A guy named Billy Long, who is a former U.S. congressman from Missouri, and he has been tapped by Trump to take over for Danny Werfel, who is the current commissioner that was nominated by Joe Biden and was approved by Biden's Senate. And so he's the one that's in there right now. Question is whether Long has the wherewithal to do the job. Billy Long was not on any of the tax writing committees when he was in Congress. He is not an attorney. He's not an accountant. He's not a CPA. So he's got no professional tax background. And so the question is, why Long? The only thing I've been able to come up with is Trump likes Long because Long has come out in favor of abolishing the Internal Revenue Code and the Internal Revenue Service as we know it. He was a prior supporter of the Fair Tax Act when he was in Congress. So I think that's the desire that's coming through on Trump's part here. I can't swear to that, but that's what it looks like to me.
So he's not a crack all-star know-it-all in the area. He's just someone who wants to get rid of it. That's promising. That's promising.
It is promising, but I sure would like to see a guy that's got some experience in there. Now, the Trump administration and the Trump transition people have not called me. Why not? Tag the Trump team. All right. You get these videos out, forward them, like them, share them across social media so they can get this information in their face. They need to call me on the phone.
He's the most knowledgeable person when it comes to tax policy, tax procedure, IRS procedure. He knows the IRS better than the IRS knows the IRS. Dan Pilla for IRS commissioner.
Well, I don't know about that, but I certainly need to be guiding the Trump team on what's going on here.